Okay, we do start on time. For those of you who aren't present, I just give a 1 or 2 minute who we are. This is the North Jersey Civil War Roundtable, and we are also co-sponsored by Bucks County Civil War Roundtable. Our program is offered to quite a number of libraries in our area, and other libraries are welcome to take our link. We don't charge for it, obviously, and we're self-funding, and we're not a fundraising organization, and we don't want to ask anybody for anything along that line. Obviously, you're welcome to become a member. One of the perks we do have, you heard, is a members only book group, and we're probably the only roundtable that charges $39. We're proud of our organization. We've been in existence for over 20 years. We have had 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, James McPherson, Eric Foner speaking. We would have had a third one, but that was due to COVID. And we've had really some of the heavy duty names: Craig Simons, Ed Bars, to name a few. Gwynn from Rebel Yell was a recent speaker at our group. So we really have a nice group of, for the most part, not everybody, but most part, is either a professor or an author of a book, or both, or a combination of both. So it's we've gone away from the local type of thing. We also are sponsored that, by the way, I'll give a plug to everybody out there. It's called History Day. Every year, 500,000 students participate in a history competition in every state of the union, including Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And the winners go on to the University of Maryland. We sponsor the John Cunningham Award, and at the end of the finals will be held at William Patterson University, and close to 1,000 people will be in the auditorium at the end of the day when we give out award in honor of our member, the late John T. Cunningham. So I'll give everybody a homework assignment. It's important because students participate as a junior, senior, individual, or a group, and they can either do a performance, a website, an exhibit, standard paper, and a documentary. And if anybody interested, if you send me an email, I'll show you the documentary. A little young girl, one in the 9th grade. It's something like it's something as if you were watching on television. It's just phenomenal through that. For a period of time, we'll pick it up again. We had our own Civil War book group, and one of our last winner was Andrew Del Banco for the War Against the War. And okay, let's take care of that. Okay, here we go. Now, let me tell you about Dr. Weber. Dr. Heidi Amelia-Anne Weber holds the rank of full professor of military history at SUNY Orange. She earned her PhD in 19th century American history from Kent State University. Her manuscript, Like a Great Feudal Landlord, How Architecture and Slavery Created the World of the Upcountry Planter, was published by Mercer University Press in November of 2022. She has published chapters and made contributions in The World of Antebellum America, a daily life encyclopedia, the Handbook of Military Administration. Oh God, I gotta get better glasses. The Encyclopedia of the Reconstruction Era, the Encyclopedia of Gettysburg, and the Campaign for Atlanta and Sherman's March to the Sea. In addition, she has published articles in America's Civil War and other publications. In 2017, Dr. Weber was awarded the SUNY Orange President's Award for Excellence in Teaching and the New York Chancellor's Award for Teaching Excellence. I'm going to stop it there and continue another paragraph. But she has a contingent of her students on tonight who specifically are coming on. And I've introduced everybody. They will turn it on early. And they're here because they admire her courses. And we're thanking her really through that. So that's who, once our students come on to listen to Professor, you got somebody great coming in. Okay, now I lost my place. She's a member of various historical organizations and is an active member of her community. She was also elected as a Service Academy interviewer screener for Senator Cory Booker. She's also a member of the Field Force for the United States Military Academy. You're on.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Good evening. Again, I'll be speaking about Grant's concepts of leadership in taking Tennessee and the strategic operations that secured Shiloh. As we start, I'm sorry, just want to make sure this works. I just want to introduce you to Missy. You might hear her barking in the background. I decided to give the lecture from upstairs. So I just wanted, right now she's snoring very loudly, but she's also a Southerner. She's from Mississippi, so she's a little sensitive about this topic of the Civil War. So I just wanted to let you know she is listening from the other room, just in case the evil UPS man or somebody stops by, or my pet bear that likes to bring its 4 babies around often. So in starting our story, in the news that was reported from the New York Times on April 10th of 1862, the comments were included, quote, "Our force was then increased by the arrival of General Grant, with troops from Savannah, and the inspirited by reports of the arrival of 2 divisions of General Buell's army. Our loss this day was heavy, and besides the killed and wounded, embraced our camp equipage and 36 field guns. The next morning, our forces, now amounting to 60,000, assumed the offensive, and by 2 p.m. had retaken our camp and batteries, together with some of the enemy's 40 guns and a number of prisoners, and the enemy were in full retreat, pursued by our victorious forces." The Battle of Shiloh, for many, was seeing the elephant. It was their first time. It shocked the nation. It was a Union victory, but one that came at great cost. Later in life, Ulysses Grant reflected on the battle, stating, quote, "The Battle of Shiloh has been more persistently misunderstood than any other engagement between National and Confederate troops during the entire rebellion." End quote. In many ways, Grant was right. This battle changed many opinions about the war and its conduct, as well as what happened strategically and operationally at Shiloh. Following the successful campaigns at Forts Henry and Donelson, Grant started to evolve as a military realist. At this point in the war, Grant was beginning to really learn some important lessons. One, when 2 poorly trained armies confront each other, there's no need to delay combat until one's men are effectively trained. The second thing Grant was starting to learn was that during the course of battle, each side will have a moment in which they will wish to stop fighting. They might pause, they might hesitate, but whichever side can continue on will be the one that is most likely to prevail. The third thing that is so important that he was learning is that troop morale is better in the course of campaigning as opposed to just training. War means fighting, and that's exactly it. So the feints and the demonstrations do not really accomplish all that much. The real object of a campaign is not to make the enemy retreat, but to destroy him. While Grant was starting to really learn, these lessons, we see that he, is kind of on this euphoric from having attained these victories, opened up the gateway to Tennessee, but things change very rapidly. Grant was not all that unfamiliar with problems in his life or changes per se, but some of the most dramatic transformations of his career were about to happen. He was acquainted with failure. This chaos would startle him. Those victories, the victory at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, put him into the limelight. But then we will see he advances, and you can see on the map, to Nashville, secured the capital, which is not what Halleck wanted. In his ire, Major General Henry Halleck overlooked the fact that Grant was conscious of operational possibilities before him and thus modified his plan according to the situation, which, by the way, was very common and almost typical in 19th century warfare. But he was displeased with Grant for doing this. Grant had modified his plans, and it doesn't have a positive result. Why? His failure to communicate. Grant was relieved of his command, albeit temporarily, 9 days to be exact. Halleck wrote him in the beginning of March 1862. In this letter, he said, quote, "You will place Major General C.F. Smith in command of expedition and remain yourself at Fort Henry. Why do you not obey my orders to report strength and positions of your command?" End quote. The Union High Command fully believed that it was Smith, not Grant, who was responsible for the victory at Fort Donelson. Halleck was ordered to replace Grant as commander of the Union forces that were on the Tennessee River line. Grant had left his departmental boundaries without permission. He had coordinated, he had tried to work with Major General Don Carlos Buell, who, by the way, Halleck didn't like either. There was also speculation, and something that will come up frequently in Grant's career, that he had, quote, resumed his old habit, end quote, of being drunk while in command. These allegations were noted in correspondence between Halleck and McClellan. Halleck followed up with this letter in another one, in which he wrote, quote, "You're going to Nashville without authority, and when your presence with your troops was of the utmost importance, was a matter of very serious complaint at Washington. So much so that I was advised to arrest you upon your return," end quote. Grant was a little bit surprised to be arrested upon return, but he penned a letter in support of his replacement, Major General Charles Ferguson Smith. He was soon returned to command. President Abraham Lincoln had found out about his dismissal and asked Halleck why. He needed specifics as to why this had been done. Halleck actually recoiled. He sent a letter to the War Department that he would return Grant to command, as he was content with Grant's rationalization. Grant recorded that, quote, "On the 13th of March, I was restored to command. And on the 17th, Halleck sent me a copy of an order from the War Department, which stated that the accounts of my misbehavior had reached Washington and directed him to investigate and report the facts," end quote. The harsh realities of what had just taken place stayed with Grant, but he was henceforth more cognizant about keeping his superior officers better informed of his actions. This is going to come into play as we start to look at his operations. Grant, by the way, had also been promoted to Major General of the Volunteers, and that certainly aided in him being reinstated in his command. Just a note, and I want to point this out now, because as we progress through, I probably am going to skip over it. But Grant thought really highly of Smith. As a matter of fact, he said he had kind of difficulty giving him orders when they were at Donelson. Unfortunately, Smith, while he's in Savannah, Tennessee, slipped on his command boat. He cut his leg very deeply. An infection set in. He developed dysentery. He got tetanus, and he will actually die shortly after the end of the battle at Shiloh. Now, changes had come to the U.S. Army. The Department of the Ohio, which had been created by General Order Number 92, had now become the Army of the Ohio. And Smith's, now Grant's, army, his troops became known as the Army of the Tennessee. Reinstated to his command, Grant moved to Savannah, Tennessee. His Army of the Tennessee had not been inactive under Smith's command. Having been ordered to avoid battle, Smith learned about the Confederate concentration at Corinth and ordered 2 raids to cut the vital rail lines at Corinth. The first raid was, and again, the generals at Corinth, just to show you quickly. The first raid had been done under the command of Major General Lew Wallace, of course, becomes famous for writing the novel Ben-Hur, and will be famous for many other reasons. Lew Wallace and his men destroyed a portion of the rail line, but the problem was they hadn't perfected the art of railroad destruction. As a matter of fact, upon leaving, Confederate troops were out relatively quickly and just restored the lines. The second raid was conducted by a man who's going to know a lot more pretty soon about destruction of railroads, Brigadier General William Tecumseh Sherman. The 5th Division was transported upriver by the locale of Burnsville. Sailing past Pittsburgh Landing, he looked at the terrain. He was very concerned that Confederate forces could occupy these bluffs. They could block his return route. And as a result, he sent a message to Smith advising that a division should occupy Pittsburgh Landing as a precaution. Stephen A. Hurlbut's 4th Division was then ordered to Pittsburgh Landing. Meanwhile, the 5th Ohio Cavalry was ordered by Sherman to destroy a trestle in the vicinity of Burnsville. However, the recent rainy activity, all of the rain that had been falling in the end of March, and then of course into April in our vicinity of Tennessee, is going to make crossing the creeks and the streams extremely treacherous. As a result, the 5th Cav turned back. Now, determined to complete his mission, Sherman wanted to find a location from which they could access a landing point across the swollen Tennessee River. I do want to point out, I took this picture in July, so it isn't quite as swollen as it was at the time of the actual battle. Pittsburgh Landing was the location where it was going to be the optimal to cross. Now, Sherman left his division with Hurlbut's in order to discuss the situation with Smith. Effectively communicating his concerns, Sherman was ordered back to Pittsburgh Landing. After conducting his own reconnaissance, he determined that there were no Confederate forces in the region. The next morning, he dispatched his cavalry to destroy the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. The troopers encountered Confederate cavalry and returned back to Pittsburgh Landing. Cognizant that they would be unable to destroy the rail lines, Sherman ordered his troops to encamp about 3/4 of a mile from the landing. Back in command, Grant will set out from Fort Henry on March 16th and arrive the next day at Savannah, where he will establish his headquarters. He does so at the Cherry House, or also called the Cherry Mansion. That was when he found that Smith was confined to a bed because of his abrasion that had developed a tetanus infection. Upon his arrival, Grant immediately wanted to learn about the status of his divisions. It was also at that point when Grant was informed that Smith planned to relocate his headquarters to Pittsburgh Landing, where currently there were 2 of his divisions. Now, with this, we will see the 4th and 5th, I should point out. Grant, however, decided to stay in Savannah. Some question this decision, and this is something that's going to be questioned about Grant's leadership skills and bring him into some controversy here. Essentially, the men who were already in Savannah, so we're talking about only 2 of his divisions are in Pittsburgh Landing, which is roughly 8 miles away. The rest are in Savannah. They had established camp. They were relatively comfortable. Army headquarters were in Savannah. There were not enough residences. There were not enough places for the soldiers in which to reside, but it was a convenient locale from which Grant could communicate with his senior officers. He was learning the lessons from past actions and really evolving as an officer. Grant was careful to visit his men each and every day, which was important in fostering mutual trust, a vital mission command principle. The ground upon which the Union forces were positioned at Pittsburgh Landing was defensible, but Sherman's men hadn't entrenched. And here, this is going to be an issue. And again, you can see on the map here, I'm sorry, I guess I can't realize, but if you go down to the bottom where you look at, you can see Memphis on the far, well, looking at it, it would be on your far left. You go to the right, you can see Shiloh, you can see Pittsburgh Landing, Savannah, and then Corinth. So just to kind of get your geographical positioning. With the arrival of other divisions at Pittsburgh Landing, these men just made camp behind Sherman's line. The men that were arriving didn't entrench in either. Smith was ill. Major General John McClernand was at Savannah. So Sherman is in command at Pittsburgh Landing. He placed the bulk of his divisions in a camp that blocked the Corinth Road, and a brigade of his division in camps astride the Hamburg-Savannah Road. And so this just kind of a rough map from the battle. These were the avenues of approach to Pittsburgh Landing that the Confederates could take. As other divisions arrived, Sherman assigned them to camps. Hurlbut's division went into the camp southwest of the landing along the Hamburg-Savannah Road. Smith's division, which was temporarily, well, supposed to be temporarily, under Brigadier General W.H.L. Wallace, his command, occupied camps along the Pittsburgh Landing Road. Now, Sherman had given detailed instructions for establishing camps so that they were tactically situated, which should allow soldiers to access the lines of battle expeditiously. Unfortunately, most of the commanders did not listen, and they established their camps based on comfort, as well as access to water, not tactical dispositions. It's somewhat questionable as to why when Grant arrived, he didn't have them entrenched. This is contrary to what they learned at the United States Military Academy at West Point. In many ways, this reflects the thoughts that the attack wasn't going to take place here. Sherman really believed that the Confederate forces were going to remain at Corinth. Meanwhile, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston was busy readying and reorganizing his forces. Meanwhile, Buell's Army of the Ohio, en route from Nashville, were halted in their crossing of the Duck River. The Duck River is about 80 miles from Savannah. The bridges there had been destroyed. Once they finally are able to make the crossing of the Duck River, they marched towards the Tennessee River. The Confederate forces were not completely sure how many numbers there would be, but they knew they would definitely be outnumbered if Buell was able to unite with Grant. For now, Grant has 5 of his divisions at Pittsburgh Landing. The first, under Major General John McClernand. The second division, which now was then commanded by Smith, who is ill, and then Brigadier General W.H.L. Wallace. The 4th Division, under Stephen A. Hurlbut, and William Tecumseh Sherman's 5th Division. In addition to them, they have a brand new 6th Division. It's under the command of Brigadier General Benjamin Prentiss, a man whom Grant basically despised. The soldiers of the 6th Division were very green, and this will be seen when it comes time to battle. They were certainly ones seeing the elephant. Roughly 4 miles from all of these forces was the 3rd Division under the command of Major General Lew Wallace. They were at a location called Crump's Landing on the west bank of the Tennessee River. With the troops in all of these locations, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston had to decide where to attack, when to attack, and whom to attack. He really planned on moving quickly to catch the Union soldiers by surprise. Now, all was not quiet in the vicinity of Shiloh. Routine reconnaissance had actually exposed the Union forces as the Confederate troops were observing the Union troops. They were watching the Federal reconnaissance take place. When Grant arrived at Pittsburgh Landing on the night of the 4th, it was one of those nights of torrential, heavy rains. He experienced a mishap. On his way to visit Sherman for an update, his horse stumbled and fell. Grant's leg got caught between the horse and the ground, leading to a sprain that would render him on crutches for the next few days. Although there had been some encounters, like earlier in the day, when the advance picket from the 77th Ohio observed Confederates at Say Field, Sherman dismissed it. There was even a minor skirmish that took place, but again, it was given very little credence. Sherman was still convinced that the bulk of the rebel army was at Corinth, which of course becomes known as the Crossroads. He persuasively discussed this opinion with Grant, but Grant was in the belief as well. Taking Sherman's report, what he thought as well, Grant went back to the Cherry Mansion. It is April 5th, and he was confident that no attack would take place. He telegraphed Major Henry Halleck, keeping the lines of communication open, and he wanted to keep him informed. In this message, Grant stated, quote, "I scarcely have the faintest idea of an attack, a general one, being made upon us, but will be prepared should such a thing take place," end quote. The reality is those words would certainly haunt both Grant and Sherman on the very next day. Although the Confederate advance, and there's a series of mishaps, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but for the Confederate forces, they were supposed to leave early. They get caught in rains. There's problems in certain crossings. They really wanted to attack days earlier, and it just was somewhat a mishap after mishap. They essentially surprised the Union forces in their attack in the early morning of April 6th at Shiloh. Though the Confederate forces, as they came through those lines of trees, were disorganized, the Union forces were completely disorganized as well. They were completely disjointed. And so many of the Union forces retreated back to Pittsburgh Landing. And here you can see just the line of attack that took place as the advance and the push towards the Union forces that will happen on April 6th. Major General U.S. Grant is at the Cherry House. He's in Savannah, 8 miles away. He planned on meeting with Buell that day, who had recently arrived. Grant also intended to relocate his headquarters to Pittsburgh Landing. The surprise attack, however, will alter his day completely. Now, Grant was having a cup of coffee. He just had taken a sip when he paused. He heard the noise of what appeared to be cannon fire. He told him it was time to go. The men quickly boarded the Tigress, and they set sail destined for Crump's Landing. Upon reaching Lew Wallace, they received confirmation that the attack was underway. Grant assures Major General Lew Wallace that he would send him orders once he had assessed the situation of Pittsburgh Landing. This is a key aspect of mission command principle, that the shared understanding of a commander's intent is apparent. Unfortunately, this exchange right here and the one that would follow would ultimately lead to the famous controversy and a lifetime of animosity between these two men. Upon his arrival at Pittsburgh Landing, Grant was absolutely dismayed upon the sight before him. Thousands of Union soldiers had bolted from the field of battle. They stood waiting on the bluffs, and this is going to require quick thinking by Grant. Grant quickly ordered for more ammunition to be brought up. Then he dispersed 2 regiments to round up those who were lingering around and off the battlefield. Grant will then venture further out. It was when he made it to Sherman's line that he truly comprehended the complexity of the Confederate assault and the severity of the situation. Grant ordered, his assistant adjutant general, Colonel John Rawlins, to send Chief Quartermaster Captain A.S. Baxter to Crump's Landing to order Lew Wallace's division forward. Rawlins drafted the orders, and sent Baxter to Crump's Landing. He thought it was best to write the orders down. He listened to what Grant said. He wrote them down. He wanted to make sure that there were no problems at all. Feel free to laugh. Now, he arrives about 1100. We see the exchange that happens with Lew Wallace. Wallace knew Grant had promised to send this information, but actually Wallace wasn't at Crump's Landing. He had left behind a horse because he had moved on to Stony Lonesome. But he did, leave a horse behind for whomever arrived from Grant's, camp to provide him with the information. He was handed the orders, and these orders specified that Lew Wallace was then to move his forces to support W.H.L. Wallace. Lew Wallace, that's why I keep using his name because the two Lew Wallaces, handed his orders to Captain Frederick Leffer, who was one of his staff officers. Leffer put it in his sword belt. Unfortunately, during the day, the orders fell out of his belt, which was an event that would haunt Wallace for the rest of his life. It was later insisted by Grant that he ordered Lew Wallace to come immediately to Pittsburgh Landing via the River Road. Rawlins actually challenged this, though. He said it was something different. The problem is we never saw those written orders. When those orders disappeared, they disappeared for good. So we don't know what Grant had actually ordered and what he wanted Wallace to do. So the battlefield is complete chaos. Union soldiers, the green troops are seeing the elephant, are running. Grant is trying to organize his officers. He's trying to get some structure. And he was really compromised by the lack of his division commanders and their forces. Lew Wallace's men were needed. They were needed greatly. We're going to see that, there's countless injuries taking place at this point in time. Applying the mission command principle of the commander's clear intent, as well as maintaining a shared understanding, Grant dispatched Lieutenant Colonel James McPherson to order Wallace to move expeditiously. It took McPherson almost an hour and a half to locate him. He emphasized that Grant wanted to know why the lead elements were now halted. Wallace asserted that he was allowing the trail elements to time close because Grant, quote, wanted the division, not part of it, end quote. As a result, Lew Wallace's 5,800 soldiers will miss the first day of the battle, not arriving until about 1,800. Grant was deficient of these men in his attempts to stay off the enemy's relentless assaults. Throughout the course of the battle, Grant moved from the battle line to the battle line to battle line, trying to assess the overall situation, which quite frankly was pretty dire. It appeared as though the Union forces, all that they could hope to achieve this day was to maintain the line while awaiting reinforcements. For example, Grant ordered Brigadier General Benjamin, I'm sorry, I missed a slide here, I apologize. There's mistake there. Sorry about that. Ordered Brigadier General Benjamin Prentiss to continue holding the center. He argued, quote, maintain that line at all costs, which he took to heart. Grant figured the Union could maintain the center, which, in the only one not collapsing. The right flank was falling apart. The left flanks had collapsed. and he hoped that Prentiss could hold this area of the Hornet's Nest. They called it the Hornet's Nest because bullets were whipping by people's heads so fast it said they felt like they were being attacked by hornets all around them. Prentiss only had 4,500 men, but he was determined to follow his orders that were given to him by Grant and maintain the position as long as he could. Grant just got time to reorganize. Grant will then proceed to order Colonel Joseph D. Webster, who was his chief of staff, to form the last defensive line to the south. With Prentiss's efforts to hold the Confederates back, combined with that of what Sherman as well as McClernand had done in the vicinity of Jones Field, a relatively strong defensive line was created. Now, this enabled Grant to situate his artillery about a quarter of a mile from the river. This way, he could try to prevent the Confederates from pushing the Union troops back across the river. As the afternoon started to grow dark, 52 cannon were positioned, defending the Union line. Oh, by the way, regarding Benjamin Prentiss, he will have to surrender at 1730. And while the Confederates are cheering, he simply told them as they celebrated, quote, "Go ahead, you have just captured the bravest brigade in the whole U.S. Army." Day one at Shiloh had been a defeat for the Union Army, but they had not been destroyed. It was assumed by most of the officers that retreat was the only option. Grant was going to surprise them all. Another one of the mission command principles is risk acceptance. Grant was very mindful of the cost of this day's fight, but was ultimately aware of the strategic importance of this operation. If he were to retreat, not only would he most likely be relieved of command again, but the initiative to not only penetrate the Confederate heartland and seize Corinth, which was a vital railroad junction, they ultimately needed to take control of the Mississippi River. If they could do this, the Confederates would fail. Retreat was not an option. Sherman was among the officers who had presumed that Grant was going to order the men to retreat. He feared that they would go to the other side of the river, they would regroup. Sherman and his men, Sherman, was shot through the hand. He had 4 horses shot out from under him. His men had held pretty good ground that day. And he actually figured he wanted to go talk to Grant about what they accomplished, but that retreat was probably the best option. The thing is, reinforcements started to arrive. Lew Wallace's division finally made it to Pittsburgh Landing. They missed the first day of battle, but you know what that meant? They weren't worn down. His 5,800 men joined Sherman's division. Also, Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio had arrived at Pittsburgh Landing. Buell, combined with Wallace's men, gave Grant between 25,000, 28,000 more. He definitely could counterattack. When Buell approached Grant about his plans to retreat, Grant gave him a decisive answer. I can imagine how this exchange went. Grant proclaimed, quote, "I haven't despaired of whipping them yet," end quote. Grant was planning on launching an assault the next morning. You know, in actuality, Grant and Buell's armies were independent of each other. After this conversation, and maybe even before, Buell was determined to launch a counterattack the next morning. The men decided they both would. As the torrential rains fell that night, the Union soldiers' camps had been overrun, by the way. Many of them had to sleep out in the open, had to be just horrific. They listened to the men screaming and crying who had fallen on the field and had not been given any type of aid. Grant had given up his tent, his headquarters, to be used as a field hospital. It is always interesting, and I'm sure many of you are well aware, Grant hated the sight of blood. And so for a man who becomes known as a butcher, he hated the sight of blood. And so he, left his tent, let the surgeons use it as best as they were able. And he went to a very large oak tree to sit down for a moment. Sherman came to see his friend, a fellow Ohioan, and he went to really talk about, again, as I had mentioned before, a retreat, their successes of the day, but for some reason he reconsidered. A simple exchange took place in which Comp simply said, well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we? End quote. Grant's response was telling. Quote, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though," end quote. Sherman knew right then and there Grant was determined to change the tide of the Battle of Shiloh. He was going to launch a counterattack. It would take strong leadership skills to effect something of this nature. On the night of the 6th, it's when we see Grant really demonstrate his use of the mission command principles. He made sure that his subordinate officers knew that they were going to attack the next day. He did this. He went to see each and every one of them. He spoke with them. He took the time. So I always like to try to create the scene. It is torrential. It is teeming rain. Grant's hobbling around with his crutches. He's going, the muddy, the train is just so muddy. The ground is so water soaked. In the background, you can hear the screams and the moans of both Confederate and Union soldiers who are suffering from their battle wounds. And Grant talked about their shared operation. He needs to ensure that nothing happened again like what happened with Lew Wallace. He knew that could bring failure. It could be ruination of the Army of the Tennessee. It could be a complete failure of all operations. In meeting with his commanders, Grant was able to guarantee a shared understanding so that they would be able to attain a victory against General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard's Army of the Mississippi. Just as a reminder, Albert Sidney Johnston was killed about 2:30, died from his wounds about 2:30 in the afternoon during the course of the battle. Grant also displays leadership quality of determination that is something that is ultimately going to distinguish him. Even though, as I previously mentioned, most of his division commanders assumed that they would retreat, Grant said it's gonna launch a counterattack. With cool demeanor under intense conditions, Grant reassured his officers and soldiers of his confidence in them and their ability to be victorious, as was his self-assuredness. Grant could have elected to retreat, obscured by the darkness of night. Think about how easy it would have been for the Union Army. Torrential rain, there's no stars, the moon isn't out, it's a, wooded area. He could have easily crossed the Tennessee River. But retreat wasn't in Grant's nature. The decision to stay and fight, launching a counterattack, would not only invalidate the defeat of April 6th, but ultimately lead to a Union victory at Shiloh. Grant had been surprised and in a way caught off guard. He couldn't let that happen again. Although there were risks in counterattack, he was an aggressive commander by nature. And this was time for an uncompromising resolution. Back at Fort Donelson, Grant had been able to turn the tide of the battle by using fresh troops as well as a vigorous counterattack. He just planned on doing that again. Grant was well aware that his men were worn from the first day of the battle, but he was still going to use them in his assault. For April 7th, however, he is going to place Lew Wallace's soldiers on the right, Ewell's soldiers on the left, because remember the right and the left had collapsed on day one. These men were fresh. They hadn't been fighting. They were ready. In the center, middle of the attack, Sherman was on the right, McClernand in the middle, and Hurlbut on the left. The other Wallace was severely wounded in the first day. And all these guys were wounded. They just kept continuing on. The counterattack was launched as early as Grant had desired. But once Ewell was underway and Grant's men were underway, they found very few Confederates before them. Union soldiers had to traverse over many of their fallen and wounded friends and foes. The men they had listened to who were screaming and crying throughout the night. As Sherman recollected about this, that quote, "The scenes on this field would have cured anyone of war," end quote. General Beauregard, who, by the way, was sleeping in Sherman's headquarters at Shiloh Church, had planned on just defeating the Federal Army on April 7th. In fact, he sent a message to Richmond to tell them that they had a complete victory. However, the Confederate forces weren't in the tactical shape to achieve a victory or really even withstand this surprise attack. The Union counterattack, the one that Grant plans, his leadership, this assault took away the initiative from the Confederate Army. As the men advanced, they retook the ground they had lost on the previous day. It is important to note that Grant did not advance with the men, as he did remain at Pittsburgh Landing. One, he was a little bit limited, but two, he felt it was important to direct the men as they arrived, as it was stated, quote, "forwarding the arriving troops to the front." Whereas Grant had been surprised on day 6, it was Beauregard that was surprised on April 6th, Beauregard that was surprised on April 7th. The Confederate soldiers were pushing back during the course of another day of brutal combat. They weren't run over completely. They did fight back. They were able to regroup. They were able to counterattack their counterattack, cognizant that reinforcements had arrived to support the Federals, and that he most likely was not going to receive his own reinforcements. Beauregard had to decide whether the potential risk of destruction or retreat. He chose the latter. Now, as the Confederate forces have sounded retreat and the rear was protecting cavalry, some artillery, some infantry protecting the Confederate rear, Grant was now confronted with another decision in the wake of the retreating enemy. Should he pursue them? This he decided to do cautiously. Grant informed Halleck of their current situation, that Beauregard had withdrawn and Sherman, McClernand, and Hurlbut were once again in occupation of their camps that they had lost on the 6th to the Confederates. Ewell was ordered by Grant, quote, to discover the position of the enemy and press him if he should be found in retreat, end quote. Actually, it ended up being Sherman's men who would conduct the mission. He sent the 4th Illinois Cavalry, and they reported back who they primarily found were the wounded in the improvised hospitals. There was an exchange with Confederate Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest. This, of course, is the famous and the legendary story that Forrest grabbed one of the Union soldiers. He held him as a human shield so that they could exit. Whether it's true or not, we're not exactly sure, but that's kind of one of the famous stories. The decision by Grant, the decision by Buell to not effectively follow the retreating Army of the Mississippi came under harsh criticism. It is essential in military strategy to follow up a victory with a relentless pursuit of the enemy forces. Grant was still concentrating on his defensive position, and he articulated this to Halleck, mentioning that he intended to prevent, quote, an immediate renewal of an attack, end quote. In a message Grant sent to Buell, Grant emphasized, quote, the great fatigue of our men, and that certainly factored into his assessment of the entire situation. The days of the Battle of Shiloh were brutal. Yes, fresh troops would become available the next day, which would help provide some relief for the battle-weary soldiers. Grant further stated that his plan was, quote, to feel on the morning, meaning April 8th, with all the troops on the outer lines until our cavalry forces could be organized, end quote. The reality was Grant was making a command decision based on the status and the abilities, the well-being of his men. Risk assessment, again, an essential component of the mission command principle, was applied here. Grant was afield with his soldiers. Halleck wasn't. And by the way, Halleck, in all of his orders, emphasized caution. Once again, many of Grant's officers, his subordinate officers, are not going to agree with his decision. Matter of fact, Lew Wallace was one of them. Their relationship had already deteriorated rapidly, the relationship between he and Grant. He was prepared to advance to pursue their foe and was perplexed that he didn't receive orders to do so. One can assume that he was fearful, and you really have to think about this. He probably thought he didn't receive the orders again, and so he sent a message to Grant kind of asking. He didn't want there to be another mishap. He didn't want to make things worse. Wallace expressed great dismay upon learning he was, quote, to retire the division to the line the Army had occupied Sunday morning. All right, hindsight's 2020. We can all be armchair generals. It was at that later point that Grant acknowledged he probably should have been more aggressive in the aftermath of Shiloh. However, he could not rewrite history and redo what had not been done. An effective commander had to learn from his mistakes. When the civilians, as well as the military world in America, learned of the Battle of Shiloh, people were horrified. There was simple horror in the number of casualties. This number wouldn't have even fazed people on the European fields of battle, but it was the first of its kind in America. There were more casualties in the 2 days at Shiloh than had been in the past year of combat. The U.S. suffered a casualty rate of 19.5%. The Confederates a staggering 25.6%. That, of course, is reflective of their total manpower as well. But Shiloh is the start of this type of battle that would dominate the next 3 years. Shiloh really launched Grant, as well as other officers, and the American military into total war. The Battle of Shiloh was another victory in the West. And I want to remind you, we've had some successes in the West, nothing real good's happening in the East. This great victory came at tremendous cost. Grant received heavy criticism for high casualties, and once again, rumors spread about his drunkenness during the course of the battle. When Halleck arrived on April 11th of 1862, he's dressed in his pristine uniform. He doesn't have a drop of dirt on him. He's got a beautiful, fresh, brand new sword. And you can guess what Grant looked like. He recounted that, quote, Grant's army is undisciplined and very much disorganized, end quote. As a result, he took it upon himself to drill the troops himself. Halleck was very critical of Grant's action and inaction at Shiloh, yet he was the one who had urged caution about being too aggressive and engaging the enemy before they were fully prepared. Halleck once again relieved Grant of his command, and the Army of the Tennessee was given to Major General George Thomas, which was only until June of that same year when Thomas was returned to the Army of the Ohio and Grant restored to his command of the Army of the Tennessee. As people and the press clamored for the removal of Grant at a time when he was actually contemplating resigning from the Army in general. Actually, Sherman really talked him out of it. There comes a story, could be legend, could be embellished a little bit, but when President Lincoln was pushed for the removal of Grant, he succinctly replied, quote, I can't spare this man, he fights, end quote. Let's be real, that's also a shot at George McClellan. The Battle of Shiloh was rife with poor planning and operations on both sides. However, the best command decision made was when Grant remained on the field and determined to fight it out. This demonstrated his growing determination to not only win battles, but the war itself. He identified the risks. He focused on potential threats, and he was cognizant that there would be obstacles in obtaining these strategic objectives. As a result, Grant was able to change the outcome of the battle and secure a major Union victory. He effectively applied the mission command principles here: risk acceptance, shared understanding of the commander's initiative and intent, however flawed at times, and the cultivation of mutual trust among the ranks of leaders as well as the soldiers themselves. Grant used some of these lessons that he had learned the hard way in the previous months and tried to keep the lines of communication open. Also, in visiting his subordinates on the night of April 6th to discuss the next day's counterattack, Grant demonstrated that he understood the importance of the concept of shared operation. The victory at Shiloh, however costly, displayed the cultivation of his leadership skills. He was willing to take calculated risks based on identifying opportunities, something that many of the other officers did not. The battle that took place at Shiloh was far from a perfect operation. There was miscommunication, surprise attacks, and a host of other issues. Yet a good commander learns from his as well as others' mistakes. Grant's concepts of leadership at Shiloh might have not been textbook in the operational realm, but it secured a victory that would open up the Deep South and change the course of warfare, leading to the securing of the important Mississippi River and ultimately bringing about a Union victory. I want to thank you. I all appreciate you for taking the time out on a beautiful day and beautiful night to log into Zoom and join me here. I also especially want to thank Judge John Harper, Rich Rosenthal, and Henry Bayard, as well as everybody here tonight and all the roundtable. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Heidi. A great presentation. We do have a couple of questions in chat.
Okay.
And we could also open it up to the floor.
Okay.
Let me get into chat right now. And one question that was asked is, who appoints, a volunteer major general? Is it Congress or the president?
Actually, the Senate. So the Senate had to, yeah, let me rephrase that. The name was brought to Lincoln, and then the Senate approves it.
Okay, great.
And he was, and just by the way, this might sound weird to us modern day, the Senate was unanimous in voting in favor of his appointment to the command as Major General of Volunteers.
Great. We also have a question from Fernando, who again, as he talked about, is an expert on Civil War films. But he notes that in John Ford's How the West Was Won, there was a scene between Sherman, played by John Wayne, and Grant, played by Harry Morgan, and it was discussing Grant's drinking problem. So again, this idea of is it fact, fiction, as you were talking about, how it gets into, the general history of the Civil War.
Okay, so the big issue about Grant is with the fact that when he went west, and was stationed out west. Grant was a real, he was a family man. Like, he loved his wife, he loved his kids. He was probably one of the relatively few faithful officers. And I don't mean that like all of them cheated, but he was really, really faithful. He is stationed out west, and you're in this, he's in California, he's in this abandoned post. He's away from his wife, he's away from his kids, and like most men, at the end of the day, they started drinking. Grant wasn't so much of an alcoholic, he couldn't handle his liquor. And the thing you have to keep in mind, Grant was really small in frame. He's there. I mean, his shoulders weren't particularly wide. He was small bones. He was 5'8" in height, but he just really wasn't that big of a man. And
110 pounds when he showed up at West Point.
West Point, right. So thank you. Right. So we're not talking that he has a lot of body mass to absorb alcohol, and they weren't, stuff they were drinking was probably pretty rough. And so he gets this reputation of being a drunk. He, leaves the army, fails, comes back, and he did drink. Okay, he didn't get, he wasn't on the wagon. He wasn't, completely, sober, but he didn't drink during battle. And that was something, it became a really easy thing to accuse him of. And that, of course, comes to the famous statement when, not long after Shiloh, where Sherman goes, he stood by me when I was crazy, I stood by him when he was drunk, and now we stand together, because so many of the rumors that happened during the course of his career. Somebody being a drunk soldier makes for such a great story. And then it makes it easy to blame. You have to remember Grant had left the army. He was, it kind of comes in, and people were mad that he made it out west. He's sent out, he's kind of sent to watch, and he rises fairly quickly, and so he becomes a target. Halleck didn't like him. Halleck didn't like many people, and that comes across pretty, and I wasn't trying to emphasize like, oh, but well,
isn't Halleck just too smart to be a commander? I mean, that's the problem. He's like an analyst more than an actual.
Yeah, Halleck belonged. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you know that Neffler was a Jewish Hungarian who later became a general?
To the topic.
I just need her to answer this. I'm totally perplexed. Why didn't they think it worked out better that Wallace wasn't engaged in the first command? And Neffler lost the letter anyway, and he probably was protecting Lew Wallace or protecting Grant, and he didn't know what to do because he's a foreigner. I don't understand why there was such a ramification. It seems to me that they were better off with letting the South exhaust themselves and then having fresh.
Please stick to the topic. A short question.
So that's the topic. Counterattack's more important, and Wallace showing up late helped.
I mean, ultimately, it did. At the time, of course, in the chaos of April 6th, the first day, Grant's thinking like, wow, we need any manpower possible. And there were so many failures. The battle is close to a disaster at this, on day 6 for the Union forces, and the intensity, it was brutal, it was very, very harsh. And in many ways, I'm sure Lew Wallace became an easy target. Ultimately, as we can, sit back and look, then he has all these fresh troops. Now it's great. He's got men to, do the wings that had collapsed on the first day. So, it probably, honestly, in the long run, Lew Wallace not arriving worked out best for the Union Army. But this is something, they remained, Grant remains his enemy until, he remained Grant's enemy, I should say, until the end.
Henry, we'll take 3 more questions and then I'll come out with the final line, okay?
Sure. In line with Lew Wallace, someone asked, how involved was Lew Wallace troops in the second day?
They really had a fair share of the action because of their with the way that the counterattack was devised. And so Grant is very cognizant of the collapse of the right and the left wing on the day one, that he wanted, they're trying ultimately, as we look at our different forms of tactics and strategy, the double envelopment. That almost doesn't work. I mean, that's a really tough one to achieve, but his right and left flanks were able to advance and they fought very intently. So you see that he's got Buell, his fresh troops, he's got Wallace, his fresh troops, but Wallace's men were attaining successes. It wasn't like they just mowed over the Confederate armies, but they had great successes. And so they were really like invigorated. And because they didn't have the day before, that's why they were gung-ho, and Wallace was gung-ho to be like, let's just go get Beauregard. Let's get that army and finish this off. But a lot of their enthusiasm, in my assessment, came because they didn't have the brutal day, the first brutal day. They just had the second brutal day. They weren't, didn't have the combined, but they were very, very engaged.
I have another interesting question. Did Grant try and advance the career of any of his officers as a result of the outcome of the battle?
Sherman, number one.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, and the formation, their relationship, they're both Ohio guys. Even though, Sherman's in the class of 40, Grant's in the class of 43 at West Point. They didn't know each other all that well because of the age difference at the time, but they started to become friends. And what we're going to see from this point forward is that Sherman basically has every command. Once Grant gets promoted, Sherman then has the previous command. And then their cooperation, and I've done a lot of research and a lot of writing about this, their cooperative others, that they could work well together. They were friendly. And, there's always kind of the stories, when Sherman would go into Grant's tent, Grant would stand up and he'd be like, oh, you're older than me. And he'd be like, no, you're, higher ranking than me. And they'd kind of joke back and forth with each other. But they, for two men that got along so well, they were very different in their personalities.
Those are all the questions in chat. We could take one more question from the audience. Of course, go ahead.
I have a question, which is about Henry Halleck's treatment of Grant. I mean, what was Halleck's political agenda, and was he reined in at all by Lincoln? Because these are very serious personnel moves that could have been really adversely affected the war. And just if you could broaden the context to the sort of the culture of Union military officers. We had an earlier lecture about General Meade and the criticism he received and the number of times he had to appear before the Committee on the Conduct of the War. And there is this impression that many of the military officers, including the generals, was like a high school peer group of petty jealousies. And I just wonder whether that was kind of the norm, or was Halleck, as one gentleman said, he knew it all?
Well, it's a little bit of a combination of both. One, Halleck definitely, I think Halleck would have been, he was very intelligent. He probably today would have been diagnosed with some social disability, something. I think he was very socially inept. He he liked when Grant did things that made him look good. As a matter of fact, we'll see early in the, both their actions. Okay, if you do that and it fails, it's your fault. If you do it and it's a success, it's my victory. And so a lot of it, there is, I mean, I kind of always jokingly say to my students, it's Mean Girls stuff. Like, and you'll see that this happens among these men. And Grant, not that he wasn't impacted by this. Like I said, after Shiloh, he's like, forget it, I'm gonna quit. Like, I'm done. And Grant had so many failures in his career. This isn't, a man that's just walked on easy street in any way. And, he had a lot of issues. He had problems, in his life, and he found that, he could fight. I mean, he didn't do great at the academy. He was kind of always hoping the academy would close. But he knew, he knew how to, like, it was more intuitive, I guess, in a way for him in the battlefield, but he also was aggressive. He didn't, you lost men. That's what war is. And so Halleck was more cautious by nature. Halleck kind of followed by some of the principles, like, risk assessment. Well, that's too dangerous to risk too many men. Where Grant was like, yeah, well, we could risk, or we could, just turn back and lose all the ground we've gained. And you're going to see that, of course, again, when you get to, the overland and all the other campaigns. Grant's just moving forward and, loss after loss after loss. So their viewpoints of warfare, very, very different. And so, a lot of it is jealousy. I mean, it's definitely jealousy. Lincoln liked Grant, and, Lincoln is dealing with so much nonsense all the time. And Halleck, ultimately, he struggles with Halleck in a way because of this. Halleck's quick to report, Grant was going to be arrested if he came back for going to meet with another officer and taking, the initiative in securing Nashville. Halleck wanted that to happen, but he wanted it to be his operation, his plan, him giving the orders. And so that's where a lot of the challenges and the problems and the dynamics. I hope I answered what your question. I talk a lot, I'm sorry. And
No,
trying
thank
to
you. It's very
answer
helpful.
everything.
No, thank you. Okay, let me just wrap it. First of all, I want to thank you. It's a great presentation. One thing I do is I work without embarrassment. So what are you doing next year?
Me?
Yeah.
That's
What are you doing next? What are you doing next October?
Next October? Well, I know I'll be at a game at West Point, but
Okay.
aside from that, I don't.
Not on a Thursday night. No, I'm serious. It was a great presentation. I learned a lot, and I should be polite and say I'd like to invite you back. But
I would love to come back.
I'm in the military. I'm in order.
I would love to
Great
come.
presentation, Heidi.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Wonderful.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful, well researched.
I
Yeah,
just want to
correct.
quickly say there was someone that I just saw really quickly in the I don't want to, I know there's a ton, but a question was asked about was Beauregard a West Pointer. He graduated in the class of 1838. He was number 2 in his class. And I did just see a comment about Grant being a casual drinker. What we think of as a casual drinker compared to what was casual then are 2 very different things. But Grant didn't, like, he wasn't drunk, like he didn't go into battle like wasted. And so, alcohol is really your friend. I hate to say that, in this time period. You think we're lacking medicine, we're lacking so many different things. So what we deem as drunk and what we think of probably a little bit different in dynamics.
All right, real fast. Again, thank you. Next month, we're going to have our legal presentation. That'll be on the third Thursday because of Thanksgiving. If anybody'd like to become a member, help support us, fine. The other thing is we do have our members only book group, and that meets on the first Thursday of a month. So again, we're welcome to. And again, one shout out, Johnny Russer's on. He's just elected to the Union County Hall of Fame.
Thank you, Rich.
Yeah, thank you. In many events, thank you and good night. Okay.
Good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank you very
everyone, for
much.
spending your Thursday
Right.
night with me. Thank
Great
you. I appreciate
presentation.
it. Thank you. Thank you, Judge
Thanks.
Tucker. Thank you for asking me. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.